Hello, my name is Theo Argitis. I'm the Ottawa bureau chief for Bloomberg News. I also run Canadian government and economic coverage for Bloomberg. And I am with Nik Nanos, the chief data scientist for Nanos Research Group, a couple of blocks away from here, or maybe a couple of buildings away from here. The most preeminent data scientist in Ottawa, the most preeminent pollster in Ottawa, and someone who, like myself, has been extremely busy over the last 6 weeks covering the election. And I can't think of anyone who I'd prefer breaking down the election results than Nik. So thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you, Theo, and all your viewers.
The election result was an interesting one because it more or less produced a status quo result. The composition of Parliament was little changed. There were some up and downs during the election campaign, and it was, I would say, a pretty intense campaign. It certainly felt that way to me. But I'm wondering, what was the in your eyes, what was the message, if any, that voters sent to the political parties during this campaign?
Well, I think the main message, Theo, was that Canadians feel that they're faced with imperfect choices. I think the fact of the matter is that the Liberals called the election. There was no defeat in the House of Commons. The Liberals called the election wanting to win a majority government. They were in majority territory in July, but the campaign basically was a reset, and the Conservatives under Erin O'Toole became quite competitive. That said, there were difficulties for both the Liberal campaign and the Conservative campaign. The Liberals were dogged with questions related to calling the election and the cost of the election, and the Conservatives likewise, although they had a pretty good performance, had to deal with issues like banning firearms and so forth. So it was quite a mixed bag. Why don't we just say, Theo, I don't think there's one loser in this election. There's two losers. Actually, if we count the Canadian electorate, there's three losers in this election: Erin O'Toole, Justin Trudeau, and the Canadian public. But Justin Trudeau did manage to win another minority government.
And what was, is there one surprise here for you? Did you see something in the results that, that despite the fact that there were no changes, that actually surprised you?
Yeah, actually, it was the People's Party of Canada. And the People's Party of Canada is a protest party. It's led by former Conservative cabinet minister Maxime Bernier. Maxime Bernier also ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party. And his movement, I won't call it a party, his protest movement did much better than anyone anticipated. They only going into the campaign had about 1.5 to 1.9% support, so they're non-existent for all intents and purposes. They finished off with 5%, and that might now sound like a lot. But for example, for the Conservatives that won the popular vote, that 5% could have actually made the difference between a Conservative and Liberal victory. And the other thing is, what's clear is that for that protest movement, it punched above its weight politically. That disruptions to the Liberal campaign and Justin Trudeau's campaign events basically changed the narrative. Justin Trudeau had to respond. Erin O'Toole, the Conservative leader, had to respond. Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the New Democrats, had to respond. So all of a sudden, the campaign wasn't focused on the issues that Canadians wanted to hear about. The campaign was focused on protesters against Justin Trudeau. So that movement, although small, punched above its weight and disrupted the narrative of the campaign from focusing on the pandemic and the economy into focusing on vaccinations and protest.
How much of that, and I guess there's plenty of debate going on how much of that PPC vote came from the Conservative Party. But do you think the fact that, or how much of the bleeding, let's say, that the Conservatives did towards the PPC, how much of that was due to ideological shift that we saw the Conservatives make? We saw the Conservatives try to moderate their platform. We saw the Conservative leader try to convey a more centrist kind of image. Was there an ideological thing going on here, or was it really just about, protest?
Well, actually, that I call it a protest movement because it included a number of components, right? It was a bit of a coalition. People that are concerned or vaccine hesitant, people that are disappointed, don't like the federal parties, people that are upset at Ottawa, and also disaffected conservatives that did not like the fact that Aaron O'Toole was moving the Conservative Party more towards the center. But the fact of the matter is, although conservatives will like to say that those folks aren't conservatives, when we ask those People Party supporters, 80% of them would consider voting Conservative. Their leader is a former Conservative cabinet minister and ran for the Conservative Party. So I think it's hard for people to actually think that these folks are not connected to the Conservatives. That's where they draw from. But it's a broader movement beyond disaffected conservatives, because it also includes people who are disaffected and disappointed and angry at Ottawa and all the federal parties. That's why I think it's more of a protest party than something that's ideological, but it's a bit of a mixed bag. How about if we call it a popular front of protest that is both ideological, vaccine hesitant, and people that are just mad at the federal government?
Yeah, I guess the flip side of that coin is the Conservatives kind of moving more to the center. The votes that they received from that shift didn't offset the votes that they lost, let's say, to their right. Is that what, I mean, clearly one of the big failures, if you want to call it that, for the Conservatives is that they just didn't break through in the Toronto region, really. Is that, I mean, how do you explain that? Is that, was that execution? Was there something more fundamental going on there? Why didn't Aaron O'Toole and the Conservatives break through more in the kind of suburban, the suburban areas around Toronto and Vancouver, let's say?
Yeah, well, Theo, the thing is that when we look at the trend line over the course of the election, there was one point in the election where in the CTV Globe Nanos tracking, we had the Conservatives actually 5 points ahead of the Liberals. That was at the beginning. This is when Aaron O'Toole was exceeding expectations. He was a steady performer day in, day out in the campaign. He had actually come out to say that he was pro-choice, which was a big signal. He had also rolled out a pretty ambitious mental health platform in order to protect the Conservatives or defend on attacks from the Liberals on healthcare. And when that was happening, the Conservative numbers moved, and Aaron O'Toole's brand personally improved significantly. But then there was a bit of a recoil effect. That started at least with the first French debate, where there was a bit of political skating, so to speak, by Aaron O'Toole, where on the issue of banning assault weapons, there was a spotlight put on the difference between what he was saying and what was in the Conservative platform, and the Conservatives had to make an adjustment there. And then what we saw was for Conservative strategists, the very unfortunate timing of Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, who's also a former Conservative cabinet minister, having to reverse himself on vaccination passports. That 1-2 punch basically took the wind out of the sails of the Conservatives. It's interesting to see they still won the popular vote. What might have happened if it weren't for those two events? And potentially maybe Aaron O'Toole would have done better. But the fact of the matter is, and this is my last point on this, the fact of the matter is that the Conservatives are awash. They picked up a couple extra seats in more progressive parts of the country, like Atlantic Canada. They picked up one in Quebec, for example, and also in Ontario. But it was offset by losses in what I'll say the Conservative heartland in the West.
How close did they come to winning?
The Conservatives or the Liberals?
That's right, the Conservatives. The Conservatives.
Well,
I mean, what were the margins really?
Yeah, well, the thing is, in most democracies, if it was a proportional vote, they would have won, because they did win the popular vote by a little less than 2 percentage points. But the challenge for the Conservatives is that the distribution of their support, the math and structure of the vote, did not favor them. In Western Canada, which makes up about 30 to 35% of all the ridings across the country, the Conservatives are exceptionally strong. They have large margins of victory. So compare that where in the prairies, where the Conservatives win by 5, 10, 15, 20,000 votes in a riding. Compare that to the Liberals that win a greater number of ridings by a larger margin. So the structure of the math behind the Conservatives means that to win an election, they realistically need 35% support, while the Liberals, you can see, won an election with 31% support because the Liberal support was better spread in order to convert into ridings.
So the one issue that people talked about certainly early on, or when Canadians were polled about kind of as important issues, was affordability. It did surface as a big issue in many ways throughout the campaign. But at the same time, the voters who are probably the most vulnerable to affordability issues in cities and suburban centers still voted for the Liberals. So how do you reconcile that? Did the Liberals actually have a concrete message on affordability, or was affordability not really as big of an issue as people thought? Like, how do you reconcile this idea about this being an affordability issue, but the Liberals not looking like they were particularly vulnerable on this issue?
Yeah, well, the thing is that all of the major parties were falling over themselves on housing affordability and the cost of living. They all had competing visions for how to manage and control and make it a little easier for people to afford their rent. The thing is that, Theo, in the very first part of the campaign, we did a study, and the study suggested about 15% of Canadians were worried or somewhat worried about whether they'd be able to pay their rent or their mortgage in the next 30 days. That converts into about 4.9 million households, which explains why, when there's only 15 million voters, when 5 million households are worried about housing affordability, all the parties were all over it. I think what effectively happened was, because all of the parties had significant platform focus on housing affordability, even though they had different approaches, it's kind of like mutually assured destruction. They canceled each other out, was no advantage for any of the parties, and we defaulted to what I'll say past voting behavior.
One of the outcomes potentially of this election, or certainly the status quo anyways, is you have a center-left party that is increasingly left, relying on even more left-leaning party to pass legislation, potentially shifting the government agenda even more leftward. What type of appetite do Canadians have for kind of more left-leaning policies? How are we seeing a leftward shift in the political spectrum here?
I think if there was an appetite for more left-wing policies, the Liberals would have won a majority. I think the fact, and we have to remember, Theo, the Liberals came in at around 32%. So think of it this way. Almost 7 out of every 10 Canadians were yelling at their television set on election night that this government, I found it surprising that Justin Trudeau on election night believed and said that he's received a mandate to continue what he's doing. The reality is that the vast majority of Canadians have voted against this government. It should be a bit of a wake-up call that it should be moderating its policies if it wants to at least be in sync with a greater number of Canadians. So, I don't believe, my personal view of Canadian values, because some people have said under Stephen Harper, Canada moved to the right. Other people believe that under Justin Trudeau, it's moved to the left. My research suggests that Canadian values are immutable. What do I mean by that? I mean that Canadians believe in hard work. They believe in respect for each other. They believe in peace, order, and good government. That when there's a pandemic, they're okay with deficit spending, but it doesn't mean that they want that forever. In the same way that when there's prosperity, they want Canadians to be able to reap the benefits of their hard work. So I would say that Canadians are pragmatic. Based on the situation, they can embrace either more right-wing policies or more left-wing policies, because the vast majority of Canadians are in the center.
Nik, we're running out of time, but I just really want to quickly go to our collaborative effort, the Bloomberg Nanos Canadian Confidence Index. And we've seen a trend over the last 5 weeks, really over the campaign, still elevated levels historically, but a sharp decline over the last 5-6 weeks to something that is a little bit closer to historical average. What do you see in that trend? Is that something to be worried about if you're monitoring the Canadian economy?
Yeah, it should be worried. The Bloomberg Nanos Canadian Confidence Index actually showed negative pressure on confidence about 6 weeks ago. And, the thing is, Theo, as you know, and all of the viewers know, that the Canadian economy registered a contraction of about 1.1% on an annualized basis in terms of the GDP. And inflation, there was big inflation news during the course of the election. Our research suggests that Canadians are bearish, not bullish, about the future when it comes to the future strength of the Canadian economy. Currently, it's on a negative trajectory. We don't know how much that's fed by the uncertainty politically. But, the thing is right now, with a potential fourth wave, with an uncertain political environment, with inflation possibly on the rise and the economy potentially contracting as it tries to get through this pandemic, people are not bullish in terms of where things are going. And I would say it's a big amber light right now in terms of the future outlook. And when I say future outlook, say the 6-month view on the Canadian economy.